They said no child should remember the day they died. But Thomas Weaver remembered everything. They said no child should remember the day they died. But Thomas Weaver remembered everything. In the spring of 1873, Millhaven was the kind of place where the world moved slower than the river that curved through it. Horses outnumbered wagons, prayers outlasted daylight, and every neighbor knew the sound of every cough. The town sat between two low hills, hemmed in by mist and pine, its people simple and quiet, content with their crops, their church, and their secrets. But that spring, a whisper began to move through the streets, soft at first, then sharper with each retelling. A whisper about a boy who had crossed over into death, and somehow found his way back. Thomas Weaver was 9 years old when the story began. A small boy with straw-colored hair and eyes like gray river stones. He lived with his mother, Ruth, and his father, Samuel, in a weathered farmhouse that leaned slightly toward the east, as though time itself was nudging it forward. They were not wealthy, but they were kind. Samuel was a carpenter who built the pews in the town's only church. Ruth baked the bread that fed half of Millhaven on Sunday mornings. They were known for their laughter, the kind of sound that drifted through open windows and made even the loneliest souls smile. The town fair that year came early. The sun was high, the air thick with the smell of roasted corn, cinnamon, and sawdust. Thomas had been saving his pennies for months to buy a red kite from Mr. Denton's stall, the kind that danced like fire against the clouds. He held it proudly that day, running between tents and booths, his laughter rising above the fiddles and the chatter of neighbors. Ruth called after him to stay close, but the wind was strong, playful, and it carried the kite and the boy beyond the field's edge toward the tall grasses that bent and whispered near Widow's Creek. By the time the sun dipped low, the kite was gone, and so was Thomas. At first, no one panicked. Boys wandered all the time in Millhaven, into the woods along the creek, chasing frogs or ghosts of imagination. But when night fell and Thomas had not returned, Ruth's laughter vanished. The townsfolk gathered lanterns and torches, spreading through the fields in a line of trembling lights. Samuel's voice broke through the dark as he called his son's name again and again. The wind carried it away like a plea the heavens ignored. It was nearly dawn when they found him. The boy lay still by the edge of the creek, his hand half buried in mud, the ribbon of his kite tangled in the reeds. His skin was pale and cold, his lips blue as winter sky. Dr. Alden, the town physician, pressed his fingers to the child's wrist, then to his neck. He waited. Nothing. He whispered to Samuel, and Ruth's scream tore through the morning silence like the sound of a soul breaking. The doctor's notes would later read, "Cause of death presumed drowning. No sign of struggle. No breath, no pulse, no warmth." They carried him home, wrapped in a quilt Ruth had sewn the previous Christmas. The preacher came that afternoon to read a passage about rest and heaven, and the neighbors came with baskets of food no one would touch. Ruth sat beside her son, her fingers tracing his cheek as though by will alone she could bring warmth back to it. Samuel stood in the doorway, his jaw locked, tears falling silently down his rough face. That night, when the house had gone still, Dr. Alden returned to prepare the body. It was his duty, though it weighed on him. He had known the boy since birth. He had been there when Thomas took his first breath. Now he was there to witness his last. The doctor set his tools on the table, metal gleaming dull in candlelight, and began his careful work. He spoke softly as he worked, not out of ritual but out of respect. "Rest now, little one," he murmured, as though words could soften death. But when he leaned in to clean the small wound on the child's temple, something strange happened. He thought he saw the chest move, just slightly, so small he dismissed it as candlelight trickery. But then he heard it, a sound so faint it could have been imagined. A breath. Dr. Alden froze. His pulse hammered. He leaned closer, his ear near the boy's lips, and then in a hoarse, trembling whisper the boy spoke. "Please, don't cut me again." The doctor stumbled backward, his instruments clattering to the floor. For a moment, the room swayed around him. He stared at the boy, expecting stillness again, expecting death to reclaim what it had nearly lost. But Thomas's fingers twitched, his eyelids fluttered, he gasped. A sharp, desperate breath like someone surfacing from the bottom of the sea. Ruth's scream echoed from the next room as she rushed in, her nightgown trailing like smoke. When she saw her son sitting upright, trembling, eyes wide in terror, she fell to her knees. "Thomas," she cried, clutching him. "My boy, my sweet boy." But the child only sobbed, shaking violently. He buried his face in her shoulder, whispering over and over, "It hurt. It hurt. I could feel it. Don't let him cut me again." Dr. Eldon couldn't speak. He fell into a chair, hands trembling, the color drained from his face. The air in the room felt heavy, too full, too alive. He muttered something about suspended animation, about rare conditions where the pulse hides itself. But the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Deep down, he knew. What had happened was not something medicine could explain. For days after his return, Thomas would not sleep. Whenever he closed his eyes, he'd scream himself awake, crying that he could still feel the blade. He described things no living soul should remember. The coldness of metal against his chest, the flicker of candlelight through closed eyes, the low hum of a man's voice whispering prayers as though from far away. And worse, he spoke of shadows. There was someone else in the room. He told his mother one night, his voice small and shaking. Not the doctor. Someone tall. He didn't have a face, but I could feel him watching me. Ruth held him tight, whispering prayers until her voice broke. She thought perhaps it was just fear, a nightmare from his ordeal. But as the days went on, the drawings began. Thomas started to draw what he remembered, page after page, the table, the doctor's tools, the light from the lantern, and always in the corner that faceless man, tall, silent, watching. The lines of the drawing trembled where his small hands had shaken, yet the detail was too precise for a child who'd never been in that room while awake. Samuel tried to burn the sketches once, hoping to banish whatever haunted his son, but Thomas screamed, an otherworldly sound that shook the house, and begged him not to. "If you burn them," he cried, "he'll come looking for me again." Word spread quickly through Millhaven. People whispered at the churchyard, at the well, at the general store. Some said the boy had been touched by God, others said by something far darker. The preacher called it a test of faith. The midwife called it an unholy return. But everyone agreed on one thing. Thomas Weaver was not the same child who had gone into the creek that day. He no longer played with the other children. He spoke little, smiled less. Sometimes he'd stand by the window for hours, staring at nothing, as though listening to something only he could hear. And when asked what he was doing, he'd simply say, "He's near." One evening, Ruth woke to the sound of humming. It came from Thomas's room, a slow, tuneless hum that made her skin crawl. When she opened the door, she found him sitting cross-legged on the floor, humming to the darkness. His eyes were open, but they didn't look at her. They looked past her, toward the corner of the room. "Who are you humming to, sweetheart?" she whispered. "The man," he said simply. "He likes when I hum." Ruth ran from the room, heart pounding, tears spilling down her face. Samuel tried to reassure her. It was just grief, just the mind healing from trauma. But he avoided his son's room that night, unable to face the strange chill that lingered there. As summer burned into autumn, Thomas grew thinner. He ate little, slept even less. Sometimes he'd stand at the edge of the creek where they'd found him, murmuring to the water as though it whispered back. Ruth followed him once, keeping her distance, and she swore she heard him say, "I didn't mean to come back." The fire came 2 weeks later. A storm rolled through Millhaven, angry, electric. Lightning cracked the sky open and struck the weaver's barn. Samuel rushed out into the rain, shouting for water, for help, but by the time he reached it, the flames were already roaring. Ruth ran to find Thomas, who had vanished from his bed. She found him standing barefoot in the field, rain running down his face, staring at the burning barn with eerie calm. "Thomas!" she screamed, grabbing him by the shoulders. "Come inside." He didn't move. His eyes stayed on the fire. "Mama," he whispered, "the man from the autopsy is inside the flames. He says I wasn't supposed to wake up." Ruth froze. The rain beat against them, thunder cracking overhead, but all she could hear was the boy's soft, steady voice. "He says he's coming back for me." Thomas added quietly, "And that this time, you can't stop him." That night, Ruth didn't sleep. She sat by Thomas's bedside, holding his hand, humming lullabies through trembling lips. Samuel sat by the window, staring out into the rain, praying to a God he wasn't sure was listening. The next morning, Thomas asked to see Dr. Alden. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "I need to finish something," he said. The doctor, now pale and shaken from weeks of guilt, agreed. Perhaps, he thought, the boy only needed closure, to see that there was nothing left to fear. He led Thomas and Ruth into his office, the same dim room where the child had once lain cold and lifeless. The air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves remembered. Thomas looked around slowly. His eyes found the table first, then the lantern on the shelf. His breathing quickened, a tremor in his small hands. He reached out, touching the table's surface. "It still remembers me," he whispered. Dr. Alden frowned, his voice gentle but uneasy. "Thomas, what do you mean?" The boy didn't answer. His fingers traced the wood, his gaze distant. Then his eyes rolled back, his body stiffening as though something invisible gripped him. Ruth screamed, rushing forward, but Dr. Alden held her back, his own fear paralyzing him. The lights flickered, the air went cold, and when Thomas spoke again, it wasn't in his voice. It was deeper, older, threaded with something that didn't belong in a child. "I saw you, doctor," the voice said. "But it wasn't your hands that cut me. It was his." "Doctor," Alden stumbled backward, the color draining from his face. "Who, Thomas? Who cut you?" The boy's eyes opened slowly, and for a moment, they weren't gray, they were black as the space between stars. Tears welled up as his lips trembled. "The one behind you." The doctor turned. There was nothing there, only the flicker of the lantern and the hollow sound of his own breath. But in that moment, the room felt wrong, too full, too aware. The shadows moved though nothing should have moved them. Thomas collapsed, the trance breaking, his body limp in his mother's arms. Dr. Alden stood frozen, unable to speak. The candlelight danced wildly as though the air itself was afraid. Ruth carried her son home that night. He woke hours later, trembling, whispering that he had seen the man again. The same faceless figure, the same presence waiting in the dark. "He says I owe him," Thomas murmured weakly. "He says I wasn't supposed to come back alone." And though Ruth whispered prayers and Samuel lit candles until dawn, no one in Millhaven could shake the feeling that something unseen had crossed over that spring day and had never quite gone back. That year, the crops failed early. The river turned dark and sluggish. The town went silent, as though holding its breath. And somewhere in that small farmhouse on the edge of Millhaven, a boy who should have been dead lay awake at night, listening to footsteps that stopped just outside his door. He remembered the sound of the scalpel, the cold touch of metal, the stillness of death, and the whisper that came from the dark corner of the room, promising that this was not the end. Because Thomas Weaver knew something no one else dared believe. When you die, sometimes death remembers you too. The weeks after Thomas Weaver's second awakening passed like a fever dream in the Weaver household. Ruth slept little, Samuel spoke less, and Thomas, he existed somewhere between the world of the living and something quieter, older, unseen. He would sit by the window for hours, not moving, his small hands folded neatly in his lap, as if waiting for someone to call him. Sometimes, in the still of dawn, Ruth would find him whispering into the empty air. When she asked who he spoke to, he would only say, "The man who stands behind the light." Millhaven began to turn against them. Neighbors who once shared bread and laughter now crossed the street when Ruth passed. Mothers pulled their children close when Thomas walked by. Rumors spread like mold through old wood. That the boy wasn't right, that he'd come back wrong, that death had forgotten to take something it should have. Samuel tried to hold the family together, his faith a fraying rope. "He's alive." He'd insist to anyone who'd listen. That's all that matters. But even he could not look at his son for long without feeling something in his chest twist. A quiet dread that whispered that the boy before him was both familiar and strange. At night, Ruth would wake to the sound of breathing, slow, steady, just beside her bed, only to find no one there. Once, she found muddy footprints leading from Thomas's room to the back door, though his feet were clean when she checked. Another time she saw a light flickering beneath his door, like candlelight though no candle burned inside. Thomas stopped eating bread, saying it tasted like dust. He asked his mother instead for honey or milk, things that still remember life, he said. Ruth tried to smile, to pretend it was only a child's fancy, but deep down, she feared he was right. And then came the dreams. Each night, Thomas dreamed of the same place, a dark field under a gray sky, where hundreds of voices whispered his name. He said there was a gate there, and beyond it, light so bright it hurt to look at. He waits there, Thomas told his mother one morning, his eyes red from crying. The man from the autopsy. He says he can take me through, but I have to leave something behind. What does he want? Ruth asked, her voice trembling. The boy's lip quivered. He wants my heartbeat. Ruth gathered him into her arms, clutching him as though love could anchor him to earth. He can't have you, she whispered fiercely. You're mine. But the boy shook his head. No, Mama, he says I was never supposed to wake up, that I cheated him. By autumn, Alden could no longer ignore the guilt that had begun to rot his conscience. The doctor, once proud and steady, now walked like a man half dreaming. He had stopped shaving, stopped smiling, and spent long nights staring at his surgical tools as though they accused him. He would hear the boy's voice in his sleep. Please, don't cut me again, and wake drenched in cold sweat. So, one evening he took his coat and lantern and went to the Weaver home. The sky was bruised purple, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Ruth opened the door, her face thin with exhaustion but her eyes kind. Doctor, she said softly, he's been asking for you. Thomas sat in his chair, by the window, pale as moonlight, the flicker of the lantern casting shadows that seemed to move when he didn't. When Dr. Alden entered, the boy smiled faintly. You came back, he said. The doctor swallowed hard. I needed to see how you were feeling. Thomas looked out the window. You shouldn't have woken me, doctor. A chill crept through the room. What do you mean, Thomas? The boy's voice was steady, too calm for his years. When I was gone, I could hear everything. You talking to me. The sound of your knife. The prayers. I saw the light above me, and there was a man standing in it. He said, it's not your time, boy. But someone else said it was. They argued. He paused, his small hands trembling slightly. The man without a face said, if he comes back broken. And then I woke up. Doctor. Alden felt the blood drain from his face. You couldn't have heard that, he whispered. No one. I did, Thomas interrupted. And he's still waiting for me to finish what you started. The doctor tried to mask the fear in his voice. Finish what, Thomas? The boy's gaze lifted slowly, his eyes distant. D'ing. That night, Dr. Alden could not eat. He poured whiskey into his glass but left it untouched. His thoughts chased themselves in circles, the boy's voice echoing again and again. He tried to reason with himself, that it was delirium, trauma, the imagination of a child. But deep down, something darker whispered that the boy had seen what no living person should. A week later, Ruth appeared at the doctor's door, her eyes wild. He won't wake up, she sobbed. He's breathing, but he won't wake. Dr. Alden hurried to the Weaver home, his coat half buttoned, his hands trembling. Thomas lay on the bed, his skin clammy, his lips whispering words that made no sense. When the doctor leaned close, he realized they weren't nonsense at all. They were the same words he himself had muttered over the boy's body months before. Lord, have mercy on this child. Thomas, he said firmly. Thomas, it's Dr. Alden. Can you hear me? The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. It's dark, he whispered. He's here again. Ruth clutched his hand. The one behind the light. Thomas said. He says I owe him my breath. Dr. Alden's heart pounded. Thomas, listen to me. You're safe. You're here. The boy's head turned slowly toward him, eyes suddenly sharp. No, doctor, he said in a voice that didn't sound like his own. You took something that wasn't yours. You stole me. The doctor stumbled back, his chest tight. The candle flame bent in a sudden gust, though no window was open. The boy sat upright, his small body rigid, his eyes dark as glass. "I saw you," he said. "I saw what you did, and I saw him behind you." Ruth screamed as the lantern fell and shattered, plunging the room into chaos. By the time the light was restored, Thomas had collapsed again, unconscious, his breath shallow but steady. The doctor left that night with shaking hands and a mind unraveling. He began reading feverishly, not medical texts this time, but old ones, forbidden ones, those that spoke of the soul's tether and the spaces between life and death. Words like reanimation and soul displacement filled his margins. He wrote long into the night, until the ink bled through the paper. He came to believe something horrifying, that when he'd revived Thomas, it wasn't only the boy who had come back. Something else had followed. Something ancient, waiting for the door between worlds to crack open. 2 months later, he returned to the Weaver's home, not as a doctor but as a man desperate to end his guilt. "Mrs. Weaver," he said gravely, "I believe I may have brought something back with your boy. Something that doesn't belong here." Ruth's face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I think we must take him back to that place, to where it happened," he said. "I believe only then can we send whatever lingers away." Ruth shook her head, tears brimming. "No, he's just a child." Thomas's voice came from behind them, soft and strange. "It's all right, Mama. I'm not afraid anymore." Ruth turned, startled. He stood in the doorway, his expression calm. "If I don't go," he said, "he'll come for you instead." So that night, with rain sweeping over Millhaven once more, they went to the doctor's office. The same room, the same table, the same trembling light. Ruth prayed silently, clutching a cross in her hand. Thomas climbed onto the table without being told, his eyes clear, resolute. The doctor set his instruments aside and took the boy's hand. "I'll bring you back," he whispered. Thomas smiled faintly. "You already did." He lay back, closing his eyes as the doctor prepared a mild sedative, just enough to calm his breathing. "If I don't wake up," Thomas murmured, "tell him I forgive him." The medicine took hold slowly. His breathing slowed. The room fell silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. Minutes passed, then an hour. The doctor checked his pulse. Nothing. Ruth sobbed, collapsing to the floor. "You've killed him," she cried, but Alden's gaze was fixed on the boy's face. There was no fear there, no pain, just stillness. And then, as before, the lantern flickered. A whisper filled the air, low and trembling, like wind through broken glass. "I saw him again," Thomas said softly, though his lips barely moved. "But this time, I told him no." The boy's chest rose with a sudden breath. His eyes opened wide, filled with tears that caught the light. He turned to his mother, voice breaking. "He wanted to take me," he whispered, "but I told him I remember why I came back." Ruth leaned close, her hands cupping his face. "Why, my love?" Thomas smiled weakly. "To tell you not to be afraid of dying. Because where I went, there was light waiting for everyone who remembers love." Ruth broke down in tears, clutching him as if she could hold his words inside her forever. Dr. Alden wept silently too, his hand shaking as he reached out and touched the boy's shoulder. That night, Thomas slept without nightmares. For the first time since the creek, his sleep was peaceful, his face serene. When dawn came, Ruth found him sitting by the window again, not staring into the dark, but watching the sunrise with quiet wonder. "It's warm," he said softly. "I'd forgotten how it feels." From that day forward he changed. The darkness that had clung to him seemed to lift. He smiled more, laughed sometimes, and though he never again spoke of the faceless man, there were moments Ruth would see him pause, looking toward the sky as if listening for something only he could hear, and then smile faintly, as though comforted by it. Dr. Alden too changed. He left his practice for nearly a year, spending his days walking the hills around Millhaven, his nights writing letters he never sent. He spoke of faith, of mystery, of forgiveness. He said once that Thomas had given him back his soul, that some debts could only be paid through mercy. Years passed. Thomas grew strong again. He never left Millhaven, though his name spread quietly through the region. The boy who had died and lived, the child touched by the other side. He became a healer in his own way, tending to the sick, comforting the dying. And when someone was close to their final breath, He would take their hand and whisper softly, "You're not alone." When the light calls, follow it. He never performed an autopsy, not once. When asked why, he'd only smile and say, "The body is only the door. I've seen what waits beyond." When Dr. Alden died many years later, a letter was found among his papers, written in an unsteady hand. "Thomas, you taught me that death is not an ending but a homecoming. You reminded me that the soul does not belong to the hands that cut, but to the light that heals. If I was the one who stole you from peace, then know this: I have spent every day since trying to earn back what I took. I will see you when the light finds me. Alden." Thomas, now a grown man, read the letter under the same oak tree where he had once flown his red kite. The wind moved gently through the grass, and for the first time in years, he felt no fear. He folded the letter carefully, looked up at the sky, and whispered, "You found it too, Doctor." The sunlight broke through the clouds, washing over the fields in gold, and though Millhaven would one day fade, its story buried beneath dust and time, the tale of the boy who remembered his own autopsy lived on, not as a story of horror, but of grace. Because some souls don't come back to haunt, they come back to heal. When Dr. Alden died at the age of 71, a letter was found in his desk addressed to Thomas Weaver. It read, "You taught me that death is not the end, but a door only the brave dare to open. I will see you when the light finds me." And in the quiet town of Millhaven, they still tell the story of the boy who remembered his own autopsy, not as a tale of horror, but of hope. Because sometimes, the soul doesn't come back to haunt, it comes back to heal. In 1873, a small-town doctor prepared to cut open the body of a dead child until the boy opened his eyes and begged him to stop. What followed was one of the strangest, most heartbreaking stories ever told. A child who remembered his own death and the lesson he brought back from the other side.